Hello, everyone. My name is Gitika Gorthy, and today I am very, very honored to be interviewing a very special space champion, Dr. Rothschild. Dr. Rothschild is an astrobiologist at NASA Ames, specializing in molecular approaches to evolution, particularly in microbes, and is a professor of molecular biology, cell biology, and biochemistry at Brown University. With foundation in protistology and evolution, Dr. Rothschild's research interests include the early evolution of life, life in extreme environments, and the search of life in the universe. In 2008, she established a program in synthetic biology for NASA and represented the agency in an OSTP synthetic biology working group. Apart from the amazing research background Dr. Rothschild does, she also does extensive outreach, including lectures worldwide, documentaries, TED Talks, and is the faculty advisor of the award-winning Brown-Stanford-Princeton team, iGEM team. I'm so excited to be able to talk with Dr. Rothschild, learn about her journey, and research on a deeper level. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to conduct this interview.
My pleasure.
Before we get into understanding your journey and really what got you into space, first I'd like to know more about your typical day. What do you currently do and how does it run?
Well, of course, since we're in COVID times still, my typical day is not what would be a typical day otherwise. But I guess I don't really have a typical day. So I think probably more the question is what does someone who's a research scientist like me do all day? And I will say that I love doing lab work. I love sitting behind a microscope. I have loved that since I was 8 years old. That's why I got into biology to begin with. But the fact is, at this point, I run a large research lab. So I have anywhere between, maybe 4 or 5 students and postdoctoral fellows. So people who have already completed their PhD, who are getting further training. And sometimes as many as 30, particularly when you include a summer influx of undergraduates. Occasionally, I even have a high school student in the lab. And so I do a combination. I need to write papers and review grants. And as you mentioned, I've been on OSTP working groups and various other working groups. So I try to do some of that kind of paperwork in the mornings. And what's absolutely sacred for me is I need to swim a couple of times a week, because if I don't, I just go ballistic. And I'm sure many in your audience will appreciate the fact that you need to get exercise to clear your head and keep your body moving. And also for when I do field work, I can't sit around being a sort of a lazy old lady. I got to be out there and doing the work too. And then I try to make sure that my afternoons, I have an open door policy. So I love it when my students and postdocs come in. If they don't come in to visit me and tell me what's going on, I have to do a sweep of the labs and make sure everyone's okay. And more than just being okay, obviously I'm in this game to make new discoveries. I want to push the bounds of science. And so I want to know from them how their work's going. Are there any new discoveries that are exciting? And if not, what can I do to help to make sure there are? And then occasionally this is sprinkled in with meetings. So I'll go around the world and give a talk and meet other faculty and colleagues at ESA and the Space Agency and so on. And beyond that, as I said, we also like to do field work into extreme environments. I haven't done as much in the last few years. Hopefully we'll get back into the business, whether it's Yellowstone National Park or Kenya or Bolivia or, all these places that have exotic, extreme environments with hopefully equally exotic life forms.
Yeah, it was so nice to hear about your typical day. I mean, it's not only like you're just doing research and working with students, but you also incorporated the aspect of, keeping yourself physically active. I also am a huge believer that you need to have, other ways to keep your body active. I myself play basketball, and I know that it clears my mind every time I play. So I definitely can relate with the fact with swimming.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah. And many times you mentioned that.
I should add, because it's the anniversary of me getting my PhD coming up, that I actually showed up at my PhD defense having just gotten out of the pool. And I believe the comment of one of the professors on my committee was, You might, it's just as well because we probably wouldn't have recognized you with dry hair anyway.
Yeah, it definitely shows, that you like staying very active, which is good on your part. I think any age, it's always important to keep yourself physically active.
Absolutely.
And many times throughout your typical day, you're mentioning how you love breaking bounds of science. You love to be, a researcher and scientist because that's what you do. And so if you had to pick one project, what is the most exciting research or project that you've worked on or currently working on?
That's so hard because it's almost like having to pick your favorite child. Each project has been different. The iGEM projects, which is a competitive synthetic biology program where we've had teams of primarily undergraduates. My lab for the summer is exciting because you've got a competition coming up, and I get these groups of 10 to 12 or so really, really bright, enthusiastic, hardworking undergraduates. And so that brings the whole lab to another level of excitement. And so those projects have been fantastic. But there are also projects that I feel are important in the grand scheme of things. So I can't really, I guess my heart is into one of the projects, and that is an astrobiology one, and that is how do organisms survive in extreme environments? And can we make an organism that could live in an extreme environment that doesn't currently? And sort of as part of that, if there is, say, a planet around a star you think is on the borderline of being habitable, but there's no example of an Earth life form that could live there, what if you could make something that could live there? So that's a project that's kind of near and dear to my heart because it's really fun and exciting, and basically, anything. I mentioned everything in science. But in terms of a project that I'm doing right now that I believe is extremely important nationally and internationally, particularly for our national, environment, national security, and so on, has to do with biomining. And that is using organisms to be little miners. So instead of going underground with a hard hat and sort of your traditional heavy machinery, you take advantage of the capabilities life has evolved. So you may or may not know this, but about 50% of the proteins in your body use a metal. Now, it's not just, oh, well, maybe I'll use copper today and maybe I'll use magnesium tomorrow. We've evolved to be very, very specific. And so if you can harness that specificity that life uses and it interacts with metals, you could do incredible work in mining without any of the environmental costs. Because think about it, your body isn't full of pollutants and everything else. You would be doing this in a very eco-friendly, green way, very sustainable way. And so we've looked a bit at doing things like grinding up integrated circuits and then using biological approaches to pull the metals back out and make a new integrated circuit, or from natural mine tailings and recycling. So those are the sort of things that we're getting into that I think right now is one of my most important projects. But we also have one going on right now in building what we call an astropharmacy. So the idea of an on-demand pharmacy on the ground, most companies focus on medications that have lots and lots of users. So companies like Pfizer that are making COVID vaccines are going to be making a gazillion doses, and that's great for their profitability and their fame and so on and so forth. But if you're going into space, you don't have a gazillion astronauts you're worrying about. You're worrying about maybe a half a dozen, and out of that, maybe only one of them is sick, and you can't bring every medication known to mankind. And even if you did, you wouldn't have the. And so we've been focusing on trying to make very tiny numbers of doses, but on demand. And then I guess the third project that's near and dear to my heart right now, which is a lot more than you were expecting because I can't really pick one,
yeah.
is something that we've just gotten funded to do more. Great. And that is building structures with fungal mycelia. So I'm sure you're familiar, as your audience is, with a mushroom. Okay, we've all eaten mushrooms. What you may not realize is that the mushroom is a fruiting body for a fungus. Now, the main part of the fungus is underground, and it's composed of what are called mycelia. So these are tiny hair-like structures. You can sort of think of them as roots, but they are really the body of the fungus. And it's been shown by other people that you can make a mold and then throw in bits of fungal mycelia and then maybe wood chips or garden scraps or lawnmower waste or whatever, rice, we've done it with lunar regolith, and let these fungal mycelia grow and bind this material together. Then you take off the mold and you bake it, and my students have made a perfectly serviceable little stool out of it. Other people have made boards for building houses or packing material for wine bottles. And so that's really exciting. What we've proposed is to use that approach to build structures on Mars. And so we're very excited about that. And so I'm leading a team of architects from the United States and from the United Kingdom, as well as other biologists, specialists in fungi, specialists in other sorts of organisms that might enhance this project. And so it's a really fun, exciting project. We have a planetary science professor from Brown, Jim Head, who is heavily involved, because to really study these things, you also have to show how it could be put to use. And so he and his students are involved with actually doing a mission architecture, which just simply means, okay, how is it actually going to be used? You arrive, then what do you do with it? Where are you going to go? How are you going to build? How is this really going to work in real life? And so this is a project that obviously I think is a lot of fun, can be used on the Earth as well. Again, it's something that we've just gotten more funding for. So obviously it's risen near the top of my list. So yeah, those are some of the things, but there are many projects that we've had that have been a lot of fun. We've done work building a biodegradable drone, which I'd love to get back to. We've got a project going on right now with developing little swarm architectures. So you tend to think of a NASA mission as one spacecraft, and it costs X billion dollars, and it's got all these capabilities and so on. But what if you take the other approach where you're making lots and lots and lots of tiny little spacecraft? Each of them doesn't have that much capability, but there's so many of them that you can use it to map an area. So I have a student at Brown right now, Annie Chen, who's working on that sort of concept, using dandelion seeds as an inspiration. You think about it, an avocado has a single seed. It's more like a NASA mission. And so it's got to put everything into its single pit if it wants to have a baby. Whereas a dandelion doesn't put much into each seed, but it produces a lot of them, and then they go float off, and maybe we'll end up producing that approach for attention as well. And again, it's a different kind of approach. It's designed for different kinds of data, but that's also been great fun. So, again, lots and lots of really fun, cool projects. And as you can tell, I'm interested in everything. So a question of which is my favorite is impossible for me to answer.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those research projects. I mean, I personally am very interested in space medicine and astrobiology. So when you immediately were talking about your astropharmacy, I was like super intrigued, because I know NASA has like a constraint where they're like, you can only take these many pounds of, medical needs or necessities into space. So, being able to provide those lightweight resources and, incorporating more like AI and everything is so, what are your thoughts also on telemedicine?
I'm going to make you a little more sophisticated. We don't talk about weight because, of course, weight is mass in relation to gravity. And since you're now changing gravity when you launch, you've got hyper-G, you've got extra gravity because you're pushing against the Earth at an acceleration. And then you end up in microgravity on some place like ISS. If you're on the moon, you're at about 1/6 of the Earth's gravity. And on Mars, you're about 1/3. So we talk about mass. And the word we used for launching this into space is upmass. And so you're quite right. The cost of a mission is tied in very closely to the upmass. And so if you can decrease your upmass, you increase your mission capability, because you then can do other things with that mass. And the real problem is launching against Earth's gravity. So that's a huge, huge issue. Now, you asked about telemedicine. I personally am not a doctor. I'm a doctor, a PhD doctor. I got my PhD working on algae, evolution of photosynthesis and chloroplasts, another long-standing love of mine. So I guess my answer really is, in a general sense, I think NASA has been pioneering telemedicine for quite a while, because obviously, even though they're doctors, I think on basically all the missions now, you don't have every specialist represented. And so you have to do things remotely with telemedicine with astronauts. And another sort of example where telemedicine is extremely important and has been used for a long time is when people overwinter in the Antarctic. So there are a few people who stay through the winter or summer. And once again, you can't have every specialist represented there. So there have been stories about, medical procedures that have been done through telemedicine in these people who overwinter in the Antarctic. And so, as you're quite aware, this kind of pioneering work has become absolutely essential for people who live in rural areas, but particularly in this era of COVID, where it becomes more difficult and in some cases hazardous to actually go into a doctor's office. And so I think that this is an example of the sort of capability that NASA has helped pioneer that is incredibly important for people who are earthbound.
Yeah, I'm a strong believer, and it's almost like a fact in my opinion that space technology actually helps innovation and life here on Earth. I mean, something as simple as a GPS, as a new driver. I know that GPS is something that I'm super grateful for, and that was because of space technology. So a lot of the technology, whether it be in the more general basis of using your phones, or something as complicated more in like the medical industry, space technology has always fostered that environment. So I definitely agree with you that a lot of the innovations that a lot of space companies have made have helped us here on Earth.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And sometimes I get the question, well, then why not, just do it directly? Why even bother with space? We have problems on the Earth. And there are two answers. One, well, actually three. First is that NASA's budget is very tiny. I've heard people think that it's a quarter of the federal budget. That would be in my wildest dreams. It's a quarter of 1%. It's not even 1% of the federal budget. It's tiny. And the amount of impact it's had has been way out of proportion to the tiny amount of money that we receive. So the second answer is that many of these innovations would not have been done if your only goal is to have an innovation, because there are alternate ways to do it on the Earth. And so it may not be economically feasible immediately, or it may have geopolitical concerns. So it may be a better way, but if you do this, it will disrupt these farmers or this industry or whatever. But if you're doing it with the conceit of space, you don't have the same sort of problems, because there aren't farmers on Mars right now. And we don't need to worry about upsetting the geopolitical order. And we don't have to worry about, well, you can do it quicker and cheaper with a petroleum product because there are no petroleum reserves on the moon. And so you can try these things. As I'd like to say, the constraints are there, but these constraints force creativity and game-changing solutions that I believe will ultimately feed back into the Earth. And the third answer to that is really sort of a philosophical one, that we as humans are explorers. We want to know what's out there. And so saying, well, you're not going to do space exploration until everyone on planet Earth is a well-fed cow is just ridiculous. It's never going to happen. The problem isn't money. The problem isn't NASA's budget, because it is so tiny and it could not possibly solve, all the world's hunger if you just simply redistributed it, which we're not going to anyway. These are political problems and so on. But that being said, as I said, I believe there's something innate in being human that makes us want to go forward. And the story I love to tell is that when I was doing field work in Africa a few years ago in the Rift Valleys in Kenya, I had the opportunity to go speak at a school that was in the slums of Nairobi. This was a day that the kids didn't even have to be in school, and yet many of them came. About a third to two-thirds of them were orphans because of recent wars, and yet they came to these basically rooms where they hadn't touched a book. There's corrugated roof. It was incredibly primitive. I mean, it almost looked like something out of the 18th century in the United States. These kids crowded in, but by golly, they were fascinated. They knew the planets backwards and forwards. They could speak several languages, even at a young age, because a few of them would then go on to high school and college. But even without that, they were there because they wanted to be part of our greatest achievements, ours as human beings. And to me, that was such a dramatic example of why we do space exploration. We do it to benefit all humanity, and not just to feed them, but because it feeds our humanity.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. And, when you said that, it also reminded me, when I started IgnitedThinkers to spread my love for space for everyone, my first event was actually at an orphanage, and I taught 70 kids in a rural place in India. And I didn't know they would be so curious, so fascinated, and so knowledgeable and creative. Like when I would say something, they weren't scared to ask questions. They weren't scared to give ideas. And it made me, be like, oh my gosh, I underestimated their ability. I underestimated what they knew. They're like everyone else. They're curious. They love to learn. And, I think I completely agree with what you're saying. It's biological almost that we all love to explore, and everyone loves it.
Yes, and you bring up another interesting point. I actually believe that all humans are born scientists. You have to be curious as a young child to develop as a human. And I feel that it's really unfortunate that there are school systems that sort of beat it out of kids, that science is something that's sort of weird and it's for nerds and it's not creative and it's sort of this extra thing. And so by the time you end up with a really good science teacher, a lot of students are no longer interested in it. And to me, the key is to keep that childlike interest through your life. And so maybe if I seem very childlike to you, I consider that a compliment, because I think it's really important that that you keep that curiosity that you're born with, and don't be afraid to keep asking why. It is not childish. That's what makes you not only a great scientist, but an interesting person who's going to leave their mark on the world.
Yes, that is definitely beautifully said, and I 100% agree. And I can obviously see your passion bursting through the screen, whether it be about space, astrobiology, really anything science related, which I am completely, I love as well and can agree as well. And so I'm really curious, how did you get into a unique study like astrobiology? I mean, when I mentioned that I want to go into astrobiology to my teachers or my science professors, they're like, astrobiology, wait, what's that? So I feel like it's like a very unique career choice. It is still to this day. So how did you get into astrobiology?
Well, this is where I can say there maybe is an advantage to being a little older, is that I didn't really get into it. It formed around me and I helped to form it. So when I went to NASA, there was no such thing as astrobiology. Actually, the word had been suggested by some Russians years ago. There was a field of exobiology, which was looking for life elsewhere. But to understand the search for life elsewhere, you have to understand life, as best you can. And we are in an unfortunate position where there is only one data point, and that's life on planet Earth. And therefore, what you really need are evolutionary biologists. And that's really more my background, using molecular techniques in particular to look at evolutionary questions. And as you mentioned, I'm very interested in protists, so things like amoeba and paramecium, single cell eukaryotes, as well as some prokaryotes. My husband specializes in prokaryotes, so I have to be nice. I tell our children they're from a mixed marriage. So, all these microbes, I think there's this sort of weird idea that they arose early and then that was it. And they're these simple life forms. And I just cringe when I hear that, because in terms of metabolic diversity, in terms of playing with different types of biochemistries and so on, it's microbes that have done much more interesting things. Mammals like us really all have the same basic body plan. In fact, most animals have the same basic body plan. You've got a mouth, you've got a gut that goes straight through, you've got an anus at the other end, you've got a brain at the front, you're bilaterally symmetrical. I mean, you've got basically the same bones as a whale. And it just, I don't mean that it's totally boring. I mean, mammals are obviously interesting. I'm a mammal myself. But if you're really interested in diversity of life and what's possible, you go to the microbes. So that's why I was asked to come to NASA as a postdoc, was that kind of background. And when I arrived in the, end of the 80s as a postdoc, this was about 10 years or so after the Viking missions. Now, the Viking missions were two landers that were specifically sent to Mars to look for life. They landed in 1977. And they were NASA missions. And it's sort of popular today to say, oh, you know, it was kind of naive and so on. These were designed by a lot of Nobel Prize winners. And I actually think their approach was extremely clever. And the instrumentation was extremely good for the time. Of course, the instrumentation's gotten better since then. But to cut to the chase, there were 3 or 4 experiments on there. Even though one of the people involved insists that he found life there, basically they were left with negative results, or, you know, ambiguous at best. So by the time I got to NASA 10 years later, the feeling was, all right, we've shown that Mars is dead. And so now it's time for the big boys, the geologists, to do all the missions. And so it was a little depressing. But then what happened was towards the end of the 90s, 96, I believe it was, there was a publication about ALH 84001. That sounds like a mouthful. I'll say it again, ALH, which stands for Allen Hills, which is in the Antarctic. 84, because it's a meteorite discovered in 1984, 001, because it was the first one discovered in 84. So Allen Hills, 84001. And what happened was there was a team of scientists led by David McKay at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Texas. And they looked at a suite of characteristics that were found in there and felt that the best explanation was the possibility that they were created by life, so that they had found fossil evidence of life on Mars, because this meteorite, we know, came from Mars originally. And it was an enormous hullabaloo. It was on the front page of every newspaper the next day once it was published. The administrator of NASA at the time, Dan Golden, who's a friend of mine, was hauled into the White House immediately. And he said he expected to speak to some staffer. He was ushered into the Oval Office and ended up speaking to President Clinton, who was studying geology books as he walked in as fast as he could, so he understood. So this was hugely exciting. And at the same time, because of other missions, we were discovering planets around other stars, extrasolar planets. So we thought that they've existed. It's been suggested literally since the ancient Greeks, but we were getting more and more evidence. We were also getting more and more evidence for life that could live in extreme environments. So all these things came together, and I believe the ALH 84001 sort of crystallized the whole thing. And so thanks to Administrator Golden, we started a program in astrobiology, and I ran the first few astrobiology science conferences and was an editor of the International Journal of Astrobiology for a few years and so on. So like I say, I was right in the middle of it and took advantage of this and helped found the field. And the reason I loved it so much is because it not only asks some of the most profound questions that we have as humans: where did we come from? Where are we going in the future? And are we alone? But in addition, from a very personal sense, as I keep telling you, I'm interested in everything. And so rather than being put in a biology department or a geology department being constrained, all of a sudden you have to take data that's relevant, no matter where it might reside in a university or a high school department. And so even as a biologist with a degree in molecular and cell, I had to be able to talk to geologists and planetary scientists and cosmologists and chemists, including astrochemists, which are chemists that study material between stars and off planet. I mean, you suddenly are integrating a lot of different areas of science, not to mention philosophy of science and history of science, which I love. And so to me, it was just a wonderful place to be intellectually, as well as because of the excitement of the questions that we were asking.
Yeah, I think that captures really the heart of, astrobiology. And I think that's a very, nice story that you were able to figure out that this is like kind of the name for it. And this is what it, actually you were researching. So that's amazing, and definitely paved the path for a lot of future young scientists who are interested in this specific field. And so my last
just to
question,
clarify, I didn't come up with, just to clarify though, I didn't come up with the name Astrobiology, but once it was decided that that's what the new program would be called, I was all in.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and now that we were able to understand more about really how you got into astrobiology, as well as some of your fascinating research, my last question for you to wrap the interview up is, what advice do you have for young people regarding their pursuit of a passion in the STEM field, space industry, or really any career at all? Something that you wish you knew when you were a college student or maybe a PhD student?
Well, gosh. First of all, you need to be passionate about what you do. I think it would be tragic if you retire at 70 or whatever and say, what did I do with my life all those years? If you're passionate about something, you're going to do a better job, and you're going to have a lot more fun. You're going to have a lot better life. And so if there's any way that you can combine your passions, your avocation with your vocation, it doesn't mean that every day is going to be brilliant, of course not. But in a general sense, you're going to be much happier and you're going to be much more successful. In terms of something like astrobiology, for example, which is highly interdisciplinary, I would strongly encourage you to get background in as many areas as possible. Don't limit yourself to just biology or chemistry, but you do need to be expert in something. And so you do not want to be accused of being a dilettante. Oh yeah, I've taken 2 courses in everything, but you also ultimately are going to have some area that you're considered the expert. And so I would encourage people to balance, but I think that that's, in a general sense, that's a great advice. Balance your background. If you're going to be an economist, you still should know about science. Actually, every citizen needs to know about science, both because you're voting on our budgets, but also you're using it. And to me, it is the most exciting thing out there. And let me just end by saying that the science is exciting, but so is engineering. And many people lump those two together. But now that I'm also doing synthetic biology, which is considered an engineering discipline, I now understand more of the difference. Science looks at what's out there in the world. Engineering is a human enterprise to make something new. So you might look at flight in birds and insects and so on and say, what can I use from this that will help me build an airplane? And you have to look at human needs and comfort and economics and the life cycle and the environmental costs and all those things. But engineering is something that's also extremely creative, because you're making something new, just like an artist. You are an artist in a sense. And so to me, I cannot tell you how blessed I am that by this stage of my career, I'm able to do both. Because I think hopefully I've gotten the message across to you that science and engineering are highly creative fields. So I think my advice also is to young people who find themselves, lured by creative fields, don't think that science is getting the right answer on a test or a lab report. That's not the way it works. works. The idea is you're getting answers on something that no one knows the correct answer. And sometimes the answers don't match what you think they should. And you go back and say, well, gosh, is it because I did something wrong? Or is the world telling me that my hypothesis was wrong? And both of those are great. I mean, some of my best work has been because my hypotheses were wrong and something completely new emerged from the data. So, again, try not to think about the way science is taught in junior high or high school as equivalent to the way it's practiced. We need people who are highly creative thinkers in science and engineering.
Yeah, that is amazing advice. I feel like first off, everybody should find a career that makes them passionate, whether it be not even in high school, later in college when you discover that, oh, this is interesting, that is interesting, or maybe when you're getting your PhD, there's always time for you to find your passion and always following that, as well as like keeping in mind, educating yourself in different topics, being open-minded is really important. So thank you so much for the advice, Dr. Rothschild, and for your time. I really appreciate doing this interview. I had a great conversation with you, learning about your research and story.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.